Hey, right, so welcome and thank you for coming along. Okay, my name is Steve Durbin. In this context, I am representing my company, which is Ex Cathedra Solutions Limited, as you can see down the bottom. Okay, and feel free to use my email to if you've got any questions or want any of these materials after the meeting. Okay, so here's what we're going to go through. History of the bill and its aspirations, how it actually works, how it's changing definitions of data and personal data and stuff like that, and how it's changing the structure of data management in the UK. Henry VIII powers, I'll explain that too when we get there. Grabs of the changes in rights and the grabs for data, because these are quite important and quite worrying in some ways, in my view. And then there'll be time for Q&A at the end. We'll have two Q&As, one of which will be on the recording, and I will then switch off the recording. So if people have got questions they wish to ask that are more personal or they don't want recorded, they can ask those as well. Okay, we will be finished within the hour. Okay, just to be clear, I'm only focusing on the general processing here, okay, not the law enforcement and intelligence processing, although most of the changes that are made are replicated the intelligence and law enforcement processing parts of the Data Protection Act 2018. So, how about this bill then? Well, it first came out of the Johnson government, okay, and it had wonderful things said by Boris about, oh, well, we're going to get rid of cookie banners and make the UK a place for digital information to grow. Then, of course, Boris departed. Truss came in, and it was dropped on the day of the second reading, literally hours before it was supposed to go off its second reading in Parliament. Quite a lot of fuss about it, actually. A replacement then came in under Sunak as the number 2 bill. Okay, and that progressed through Parliament fairly rapidly until 23rd of May, and then it just stopped dead. They then reintroduced it without the number 2 bill on the 8th of November, rushed it through 3 Commons stages on one day. Okay, 190 days after the second reading of the previous bill, which is a really big gap. On that one day, they also introduced 156 pages of amendments, which of course there was no time to debate. So they just went straight through without any real scrutiny. And it's now with the Lords and committee stage. So these are the actual dates for anyone that's nerdy enough to want them. They didn't have a committee stage in Parliament on the second time they brought it round. There was a motion saying you can just go straight to the Lords, and that's what it did. The Lords had their first committee sitting 2 days ago. And I have to say that I've read Hansard and what the Lords commented on it, and the Lords' comments are very similar to mine. So I'm also not too far off beam here anyway. Okay, so there is quite a lot of concern about it. However, the Lords being only a revising chamber, it is very unlikely that any Lords amendments will come in. I'm just going to click mute again. It's a bit of noise there. So what are the aspirations of the bill and why do they want to do this? Well, this is what they say in the impact assessment for the bill. Okay. Some of these are quite highfalutin, but I would point you to things like maintain high data protection standards without creating unnecessary barriers to responsible data use. So that's fairly clear aspiration that we need to move things downwards a bit so that we can, in terms of rights, so that we can do better things with data. Although not saying that. The funniest line in here is ensure the Information Commissioner's office is equipped to regulate effectively. Yeah, part of the bill actually abolishes the Information Commissioner's office and replace it with Information Commission. So yeah, really doing that. But there you go. That's the aspirations. I would point you also to the last one. I know a lot of you are in public bodies, but basically, if you look at that, okay, make it easier for public bodies to share vital data. We'll come back to that quite a few times. So how does the bill work? Okay, as a piece of legislation, it's a bit of a hybrid. So parts 1, 4 and 5 are not new law. They only amend existing acts and regulations. This is a very common model. We see this a lot in the law. Generally, what they do is they keep amending laws until it gets too confusing with amendments, and then they produce a new one to sort of suck it in. If you look at the NHS Act, for example, there was a 1946 one, a 1966 one, 1977 one, and we currently have a 2006 one, and I'm betting with the number of amendments going in there, we'll probably have a 2027 one. Okay, simply because suck up the amendments and tidy it up again. This does make it difficult to read, and this is part of the reason why I think a lot of people are missing the impact of this, because to read it, you have to read all the amended acts and see what difference it makes to those acts. Occasionally, they'll publish things called Keeling schedules, which are useful to show you how the bill's changed in context, but for a lot of it, they don't. Some of the amendments, I have to say, are just minor consequential stuff, like where a section number changes or where they've changed the name of something, so you have to change the name in all the other acts. But a lot of this is very, very big new law. Another problem with this is a lot of it is enabling. Okay, so it gives the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State varies, powers to amend the regulations or to add new bits without really much by way of scrutiny. They're commonly referred to as these Henry VIII powers because that was how Henry VIII liked to operate. I don't want Parliament telling me what to do. To give you an idea of how big those things can be, the entire of the NHS's data sharing with the centre and with other bodies and the rest of it is under one regulation, the Control of Patient Information Act. Okay, most of the stuff we did during the COVID pandemic was under that same regulation, because the Secretary of State can just keep publishing regulations to change these things. I'll talk about that in much more detail. Now, parts 2, 3, and 6 of this bill are new law. Okay, I'll go through all of them, but part 5 is mostly just abolishing roles, so it gets rid of a lot of things and changes things, but technically it's new law because those paragraphs abolishing things are actually new law. All the schedules that are in this bill are mostly just longer amendments or lists of things. I'll talk about some of those lists of things later too. Given how far-reaching this is, I had to put this in 10 points, so apologies you can't read it, but basically that is the act it's amending. It's quite a long list, isn't it? So it's surprising how much it is amending. Okay, so everyone happy with the structure? If there are no questions, feel free to raise your hand or just come off mute. And if you're all happy with that, I'll move on to the definition changes. Okay, lovely. Okay. All right, so I went the wrong way. So the first definition change is actually a positive one, okay, which is it gets rid of that weird phrase we inherited from the GDPR, identifiable natural person, natural living person, and replace it with identifiable living individual, which is a bit easier in UK law and a bit clearer. The next one's a bit more difficult. So it changes the definition of identifiable data. So that's pseudo data that can't be re-identified by reasonable means, and I use air quotes there because that isn't defined in the Act, is not treated as personal data. So what that means is, okay, that a lot of the work that is done where you pseudonymize something and separate out the identifiers can now, in many cases, be treated as anonymous processing, therefore not subject to data protection law. I think you can see that's got a big impact for things like AI research, some health research, lots of other kinds of research. And when I talk about the datagrams a bit later, you'll see it's even bigger than that. It does clarify compatible purposes, which is nice because the previous law just said purposes had to be compatible if you wanted to reuse data. Didn't really say what they were. It clarifies that a bit. But one thing it does do, which is interesting, is it says that research, archiving and statistics, which it then refers to as the RAS purposes, research, archiving, statistics, are defined as being generally compatible with everything. Okay, so effectively, if you've got data for one purpose, you can use it for research, archiving and statistics. Okay, that's interesting. They also clarify what they mean by research, and that basically says anything that could be reasonably described as scientific, and it can be public or private organisations doing it, and it can be publicly or privately funded. That set my spidey senses tingling, to be honest, and the reason it did is because we have previous examples of using research like that which have gone very badly wrong, and I refer you to the International Whaling Commission, for example, which was supposed to try and ban whaling, but in fact whaling has carried on quite high levels because they say it's research. We're researching how many whales we can kill in 1 week or whatever, but basically because the research wasn't clearly defined, people have carried on whaling. under that law. So that worries me a bit because it's quite wide. The second lot of definition changes, some of them are just errors and omissions. Okay, so laughably, these actually made me laugh somewhat. For example, the Prison Electronic Communications Regulations, which regulate direct marketing, never define direct marketing. Okay, so they now define direct marketing, which is good. The Data Protection Act Part 4, Data Protection 2018 Part 4, law enforcement, never had definition of consent in it, even though consent is quite often used in law enforcement processing, particularly for verifying alibis and stuff like that, or patient mental illness, these sort of things. One which will make all data protection officers in the room rejoice is they have clarified what vexatious and excessive means. That is so useful because it's always been a judgment call. Now it's clear. Okay, we have clear statements on it. And they've also allowed legal privilege for law enforcement personnel. That was a very odd omission, but it was omitted in the original act. There's a bit of a worrying provision that amends Article 14 of the UK GDPR. So Article 14 is where you have to inform people you're using their data. If you didn't get it directly from the person, you got it from someone else. Okay, and basically in that it changes the requirements for consent processing so that if you can't reasonably seek consent, especially for the research, archive and statistics process, you don't have to speak to them. Now, that basically means if you buy a list off someone else, you may not have to tell them you bought the list. That's quite a concern, I think. There you are, that's what it is. It then proceeds to define some legitimate interests. So as those of you familiar with the GDPR will know, we've got under Article 6.1, which gives you all the various reasons you can process data. E was always legitimate interest. There's now an EA, which is a defined list of legitimate interests, okay, provided by the Secretary of State. And it actually defines some of those in this act, but the Secretary of State can change it at any time. So some of those are quite useful. So finally, it actually says that security as a requirement, security information is a legitimate interest. Hoorah! But it's also got internal admin, intergroup transfer, stuff like that. They're all fine. But then it says direct marketing is a legitimate interest. Well, that sort of goes against European jurisprudence. So that's a bit worrying. And effectively, all it means is that now cookie banners are pretty much not required. I'll come back to that later on and explain that in a bit more detail. So we have structure changes. One of the biggest, I think, is the first one there, okay, which is relevant international law now can be a compatible purpose. So no longer is it just UK law that can influence data, international law can. So if a country passes a law saying that, yeah, I can have data off the UK for this purpose, then the UK can use that as a compatible purpose. That's unusual. It's unusual for a country to actually say in its own law, other people's laws can affect us. Interesting. One that's annoying but not surprising is political opinion processing allowed if someone's over 14 and it's for democratic engagement. Now, effectively, what that means is basically they can have lists of you for voters and stuff like that. They can send you all their junk mail, and effectively, so long as it's a recognised political party or a candidate or someone else who's involved in an election campaign, they can bombard you with as much junk as they like. You can opt out. There is still an opt-out mechanism, but it is not a consent anymore. You have to opt out. I get where they're coming from with that, because I know when the 2018 Act came, a lot of politicians to throw away their mailing lists and stuff like that because they weren't allowed to keep them anymore. So that's sort of fixing that, but it does mean this election campaign is going to involve, if they get this law through in time, a lot of spam mail. And one that is close to my heart, and I know a few others in this room, DPOs, independent DPOs, outsourced DPOs are completely abolished. They are replaced with senior responsible individuals. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, if you look at the very small numbers in the thing there, that's the section numbers within the Act, okay? I didn't mention those earlier, I should have done, sorry. Okay, that's why you got that little bit of text after, just say which section number it is in case you want to reference it. These slides are available, by the way, and I'll send to anyone who asks me for them. But going back to SRIs, they are required to be senior within the organisation. It's defined as effectively being board level or at decision making, high decision making level. They can job share, and in this version of the Act now, thank goodness, they can now delegate their tasks, and they can also delegate in case of conflict of interest. So there is the ability to delegate. The original version didn't allow delegation, which meant that somebody on your board would have to deal with all of your Article 15 subject access requests. Yeah, that was going to work, wasn't it? So it is logical that they have changed this. This is good. It's only now required that you have a senior responsibility if you're a public body or you carry out high risk processing. So that's a bit woolly, but I think a lot of organisations, because they will be carrying out processing that is high risk to their staff at very minimum, okay, will probably have to have SRIs. Okay, in part of the definition of the Act said that they wanted to reduce the amount of paperwork burden. Yep, they have done that. So the record keeping requirements are now massively reduced. So Article 30 of the GDPR, which was the ROPA, Register of Personal Activities, is now deleted and replaced with 30A, which is just a record of high risk processing of personal data. So you no longer keep the details of all your processing, just that you are doing, which is high risk. Okay, that's going to simplify things a bit, but to be honest, you have to keep it anyway because you've got to have some record of the contracts, stuff like that. So I'm not sure it reduces the paperwork by much. Data protection impact assessments, so dear to everyone's heart, are now just assessments of high risk processing. They are only required if the processing is high risk. They do not require prior consultation. It's now optional, and they don't have to have a systemic assessment. It's mostly just, write down your controls and measures and how you plan to deal with the risks. It is much, much simplified. Strongly recommend to anyone's data protection person to read that because it does change things quite dramatically. All the way through the Act, they have changed appropriate technical organizational measures to say appropriate measures including technical organizational. I scratched my head for ages over this one because I could not work out what they were doing, but another announcement elsewhere has clarified it. What they're doing is they're saying if you've got certain agreed certifications, that counts as your appropriate measures. You don't have to have or to declare your separate technical or organizational measures. That's a very big change because it effectively means that a certification now can replace technical organizational measures, which was not how the original was written. It was always written as being one of potential clients' compliance mechanisms. The really big structure change about international transfers. Up to now, we've had to have a international transfer effectively ratified by the Information Commission, Information Commissioner, and they had to produce an adequacy decision, or you had to use one of the other mechanisms, such as binding contractual rules. Binding corporate rules, sorry, the IDATA, the International Data Transfer Agreement, or your own assessment, which had to be quite in depth. Now, basically, it depends on regulation, not an adequacy decision. So the Secretary of State can say this country is adequate, and you can share data with it without any further measures because I said so, and they can change it at any time. The test now for whether or not you can do a transfer without that is now called the data protection test, and it's slightly weird. What it basically says is you need to look at it and decide if their data protection law looks like ours, and whether or not you think it's comparable, and whether or not they've got respect for law and stuff like this. And once you've done that, then you can transfer on that basis. That's a really big change. I think part of it is because of the slowness of the adequacy decisions. That's always been a frustration for this government. Adequacy do take a long time. And as we sort of expected from the statement about artificial intelligence, stuff like that, okay, automated processing is now completely rewritten and legitimate interest can be used for it. That is very new. So effectively, the automated processing pieces now are very much whether or not there's meaningful human intervention in there, and it does define meaningful, okay, and you can do it on a legitimate interest basis. You do not need any other legal basis. So that's a big change as well. Okay, final button structure changes. As I said, the ICO, they get their head chopped off, okay, and they're replaced with an information commission. This is not independent. The Information Commission is directly controlled by the Secretary of State. They set their goals, they set their strategy, okay, and their direction. The Secretary of State, the Information Commission must take into account the Secretary of State's strategic statements. So in other words, they've got to follow the Secretary of State's strategy, even if they don't give them direction on that. And the Secretary of State can require them to create codes of practice for sectors. Those codes of practice have to be agreed with industry representatives. So the ICO can no longer say, this is the code of practice and you're following this. They've got to actually have industry representatives and fully consult on it. That's not too bad a change because they always did that anyway. But it is quite, it does mean that effectively the industry is dictating things far more than they used to. Some of the ICO's powers get moved, and they've abolished a couple of the commissioners. So those two commissioners are both gone, the retention use biometric material and the surveillance camera commissioner. And they've renamed the National DNA Database Strategy Board to just say forensic information. Okay, fine. It always was doing that anyway, but they just clarified the naming. So that's it on the structure changes. Anyone got any questions on those? All very quiet. Either you've all fallen asleep or I've scared you. Probably both. Okay, right, there's no change, no questions then. I shall move on to the, oops, sorry, I went back a slide there, to the rights changes. So the first big rights change, which is actually a positive one, as we all know, or most of us will know, under FOI, you always had this thing where the clock stopped if you asked for fees, or the clock stopped if you asked for clarification and stuff like that. That is now in data protection law as well. Hooray. So basically, if you ask for clarification, or if you say, look, there's going to be a fee on this, the clock stops at that point and doesn't resume until they are to pay the fee or return the clarification. So that's good. The subject access right has been restricted quite severely. Effectively now, what used to happen was you had to provide all the information that you held and it was an offence not to. Now you have to just do a reasonable and proportionate search. And it's even exempt for the research, archive and statistics purposes if it would be disproportionate. So organisations holding research data on people can just say, oh no, it's too hard to search our database, we won't bother. And you can do that for anything else anyway. So all these really complicated email searches that people do, a lot of people are going to say, well, no, that's not reasonable, I'm not doing that, it's too expensive. So that's quite worrying. You can also take into account your resources in this as well, which is a very new development and a bit of a worrying one. Okay. Just realised I didn't look at the chat. Okay, that's great. No one's got anything in chat. Thank you. Okay, cookie storage is now allowed without consent. See, Boris said he was going to get rid of cookie banners for you. The way it's been done is by taking away your right to have them in the first place. As I mentioned earlier, legitimate interest is now allowed for direct marketing. They allow cookie storage without consent. Therefore, cookie banners are not needed. End of story. But it has to be for limited purposes here. So, but that does include statistics, website improvement, security, fraud, technical faults, break controls, all those sort of things. You're allowed to object to it, but they don't have to provide a mechanism to object to it. It's supposed to rely upon browser tech telling them. So this is very much reproducing what California did with the do not share my data thing. That was never particularly successful because browsers didn't generally implement it, and this is probably going to go the same way. So, how the objection is going to work is a bit moot at the moment. They've also removed the requirement for country representatives. Now, what that meant was, okay, if you had a company that was processing UK citizens' data in another country, they had to have a representative in the UK you could go to complain about data protection issues. That is now removed. So if a Japanese company are processing your data, okay, you have to go to Japan to complain. You can't complain under UK law anymore, which is always the requirement. That's a huge change and quite a worrying one. So, but that is what it is. The second lot of rights changes, okay, as I said, under Article 14 as well. So that's informing people where you've got their data from other sources. You don't have to inform them if it was disproportionate or would impact the purpose of processing. The impact the purpose of processing one is probably more worrying, because what it effectively says is, if I sent you things and you probably object, then I can probably take that into account and not send you things. That's quite a big change in rights. There's a whole new chapter added to the UK GDPR, which with the Article 14 change I just mentioned, basically enables processing of to pseudonymized data of any personal data for the RAS purposes. So those of you that work in the NHS, for example, will know that when we want to process identifiable data to create pseudo data, we can't generally do that because it's covered by opt-out and stuff like that. That removes that right completely. Effectively, processing data to produce pseudonymized data is always allowed, and as long as it's for the research, archive, and statistics purposes. That also allows the creation of the NHS secure data environment. So they've been talking about how wonderful they're going to be for a couple of years, because effectively they will use this pseudo data, and of course it removes the local opt-out and national data opt-out, because they always had in them processing my personal data, and that right has now been removed. Okay, so that's a huge change. This also allows other data grabs to happen. I'll come back to that. Direct marketing is also now allowed for charitable, political, and other non-commercial objectives. You have a right to object here, but organizations can share data with other organizations with similar objectives. So this is going to be a Sorcerer's Apprentice thing, isn't it? They're all going to be sharing your data, and you're going to get more and more sugar stuff in your mailboxes, and you have to object to each one in turn. Rather depressing on that, but it is where it is. Okay, so you have to leave, Kurt. It's not a problem. Okay, so the recording will be available. So if anyone does have to leave, you will be able to get the recording. But of course, you won't be able to ask questions. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about the Henry VIII power. Sorry, then we've got any questions on rights changes before we move on to the Henry VIII powers. Anything? Get the chat. Yeah, Jamie?
Yeah, it probably would have been a more interesting move when you come to these subject access rights changes for them to allow organizations to charge for excessive.
Yeah, you can. So you've always been able to charge for excessive, vexatious or excessive. The fees are set by the FOI regulation for fees. The Freedom of Information and Data Protection regulation fees, I can't remember what year it is, but basically it works out at £25 per hour for staff time, and cost price for anything else that you have to use, like paper and your photocopy and stuff like that. So yes, you can charge. Yeah.
In reality,
okay.
It will just mean that we'll deny every request that says all emails.
Yeah, well, you'd have to deny it. What you can say is we've done a reasonable proportionate search of it.
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So you give them data, but it wouldn't necessarily be all the data. Yeah. Okay. Is that clear?
That's good.
Thank you, Jamie. Felix.
Yeah. Will there be a bit more? I think I've seen some stuff come through, but on data opt-outs. And then the other thing is, in the health service, we are non-commercial. What's the non-commerciality of a?
Yeah.
So there's like health promotion stuff. Whether or not we should.
Yeah.
Is
but you're seeing the direction of travel here, aren't you? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So basically, this is what's happening. Effectively, we are now allowed to process data for the purposes within the NHS. Okay, so for example, research, archive, statistics, that means all those trusted research environments can be created. National data opt-out disappears because it doesn't apply anymore. There's a legal right to do it. We're not using section 251B anymore, which gave the right to object, and that's section 251B of the Health and Social Care Act 2012, which is why the right to object is gone. Okay, and because it's a non-commercial objective, direct marketing from the NHS is also allowed. So, and anyone else, to be honest, in government, because you've also got political and charitable as well. So, effectively, what they're saying is you're going to damn well listen to us, whether you like it or not. You can't, because whilst you can object, it's quite difficult. The only right to object is going to be, if you start sending health promotion material to people and people say, I don't want that, that's a right to object and that is allowed, but they can't object to their data being used anymore. Now, that's always been a challenge in health because we could, with so many people opting out, up to 30% in some areas. Well, actually, we've got one placing isn't I'm aware of where it's over 50%. It's very hard to do planning. So effectively, they've removed that and made it easier at the expense of people having the right to say no. Okay, so that's what the big change is. So it is a huge change, really huge. I describe this as being probably the biggest change in data protection since 2018. I don't think that's a word of a lie there. Okay, it's even bigger than what happened with COVID. Okay. Okay, any other questions? If not, I shall move on to the Henry VIII powers. Okay, right. So Henry VIII powers are effectively regulation powers. Okay, there are 53 of them in this bill. That's one for every week and one over. Okay, and effectively they allow the Act and all the schedules to the Act and all the influence of the Act to be amended without much by way of parliamentary scrutiny. Like I said earlier, they're commonly called Henry VIII because Henry VIII didn't want Parliament getting in the way of him doing what he wanted to do. So that's where they came from. It's unusual to see so many in here. Effectively, with these, what happens is you either have to have an affirmative resolution. That's what most of them are in this bill, which is if you've got to put the thing on the table in Parliament. Parliament has to vote on it, and then it's done. That's it. There doesn't even have to be a debate, and that with a government with a majority means they can change the law at will. Okay, some of them just require you publish it and stick it in the House of Commons library, and if no one objects within 40 days, it goes through. Not too many of them in this bill, granted. So these allow everything to be changed very, very easily. So how big are these changes possible? Well, one of the regulations, section 150, okay, actually allows you to change the whole bill. So they can rewrite the whole of this law without going back to Parliament except for a vote. That's a big one. They can change legitimate interest. In fact, the list of legitimate interest is defined by the Secretary of State. They can also change all the safeguards like meaningful human intervention, significant impact on data subjects, what the safeguards are for automated processing. They can change all that by regulation. They can change what to safe international transfer. I've already said that because they can set the adequacy decisions. What is compatible further processing, and it goes on and on and on. If I listed them on this slide, I'd have to list most of the bill. It's that big because there's 53 of them. So effectively, this bill is what's called an enabling bill. It enables the Secretary of States, and there are several that are involved in this, to change all this lot by the stroke of a pen. Okay, that is worrying from the point of view of parliamentary scrutiny. It weakens parliamentary scrutiny, and that's part of the reason why Henry VIII powers are still something that people are very unhappy about, because it means that basically they can change it without any further debate. That's what we have. So, any questions on the Henry VIII powers? Just as a little aside, if you want to find these in other bills, because they are in other bills as well, okay, look for the phrase "the Secretary of State may by regulation," because that's how they all start. Okay, and there are lots of them in lots of other bills, but this one is particularly full of them. I don't think I've ever seen 53 in one bill before. So let's move on to the data graphs. This is where it gets really fascinating. So basically, research consent is now general. What that means is if you have consented to your identifiable data being used for research, bear in mind that unidentifiable data is not even required to have consent anymore, then basically it can be reused by any other researcher for any other research purpose, okay, because they're generally compatible. So if you've given your data to a particular hospital for a project they were doing, they can then share it with all the other projects they're involved in and anyone else without any further consultation with you, because they're generally regarded as compatible purposes. The research, archiving, and statistics use of pseudonymized data is generally authorized with no right of objection. That's how the trusted research environment is going to be enabled, because they've removed the opt-out right. So effectively, all the NHS data is going to go in there. Felix, yeah?
So, does that mean that if a data subject gives permission for their data to be used in a non-commercial research organisation, it can then be ported over for a commercial research organisation without additional
consent? Yep, absolutely. That's what it says.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, exactly. Okay. Well, like I said, it's a big change. The fact that you can't opt out of the pseudonymized use now also means that effectively the trusted research environments, we're always going to be hampered by the national data opt-out. National data opt-out no longer applies, end of story. Okay, so all our data is going to be in those. Sean?
And Steve, do we know how this is going to tie in with kind of like common law duty of confidentiality and ethical consent for research?
Well,
or is this?
Okay, right. So first of all, statute law always overrules common law. Okay, so this is statute law. Okay, so it will overrule the common law duty of confidentiality because you've got the statute. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. In terms of ethics, obviously it doesn't change the ethical picture. Okay.
Yeah.
But whether you have to consider that in your research ethics is another question, because of course what they're saying here is we are saying this is allowed under law. And you can argue about whether law and ethics are always slightly at odds with each other, but basically it's allowed under law. So it's not going to restrict the commercial organisations, put it that way.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting, because one of the things that I've only been in my role for like since October. One of the biggest things I've been grappling with is getting my head around the fact that GDPR is on a different basis, but then you still got the other consents to consider and that kind of stuff. And I know when I've looked to other organisations, like there's like University College Dublin, their guidance or videos say things like, even with anonymized data, you still need consent.
Yes, and that is probably the correct ethical position. However, what this law is doing is saying you don't have to. Okay, and then of course it becomes a ethical consideration for the people involved. Like I say, the challenge with this, I think, will be that the public sector is more likely to take account of ethics, and the private sector is more likely to take account of profit. I would point out that one of the very famous people that you will come across if you ever do an MBA, actually said that that considering ethics in business is probably not ethical because you're not taking into account shareholder value. So there you go. Okay.
Thanks a lot.
I'll remember his name in about 10 minutes, but I can't remember it now. So once I did my MBA. So there you are. Okay. So let's move on to the next data grab then. Okay, customer and business data grab. This is part of the new law bits I said about. This is a whole new law inside this bill. Basically, it gives a power to the Secretary of State to require traders to retain data about customers and business interactions, and requires them to use specific systems to record them. It covers FCA regulated bodies. It requires business to share data with others, which they call interface bodies. I think we'd probably call them data brokers, but that's depends how you think about it. And it has the power to take it and use it in government. Oh, and by the way, businesses have got to pay for this to be done. Thank you, sir. Okay, we're going to give you all our data at your request, and we have to pay for it to be stored. So that is effectively every transaction you do as a person or a business is going to get sucked into this database. It's unclear, because it's by regulation, whether that's going to be identifiable, pseudonymized, anonymized. We just don't know. But basically, the Secretary of State can lay down regulation saying, I want all this data in this system by Thursday. Okay. So that is a huge data grab, really, really huge. That's the whole economic activity of the UK pretty much sucked up into a database. It also then requires providers of internet services to keep data in connection with the death of a child. Now, this one just seems to me completely unworkable. First of all, how do you know what data to retain? Secondly, how do you know a child was using it? Because most of the traffic's encrypted anyway. And thirdly, it doesn't say how long for or give anything else. It just says it's by regulation. that seems like effectively it could be a grab for all internet data if they want it to be, just on the basis of a possible death of a child. Really seems unworkable, that one. I don't know how that was going to work in practice at all. Okay, but it could be another very big data grab. They're now allowed also to keep biometrics, not DNA, but biometric data indefinitely for law enforcement. Okay, as long as it's pseudonymized, which means if they've got your fingerprint on file and they've got a reference for it, because they can de-pseudonymize it because they know you are. Okay, and that includes data from overseas for counter-terrorism, no matter how obtained. That's an interesting one as well from the ethics point of view. Okay, that's just page 1 of the data grabs. Let's have page 2, shall we? Power to require information for social security service purposes. As usual, it's all regulation, but the biggest one in here is that it applies to banking and other finance providers. They can require account information from any accounts to which a person has access. That includes joint account with someone else or has had access to in the past, where you've received any of a number of benefits. So these are listed by regulation, but they do include things like child benefit, tax credits, loans for education purposes, and universal credit. Okay, so there's a lot in there. Okay, and effectively it allows the government to look at your bank account to confirm whether or not you've got the income you're declaring and stuff like that, without any warrant or any requirement to evidence that they suspect you of fraud. Okay. There's a right of appeal by the provider, not by you as a subscriber. The right of appeal by the provider, but there's nothing with the account does. So the provider can say, well, we can't provide you with this because we don't have this data, because they bank over there. And the provider can say, well, we can't give you all this because it's too much and it's going to cost us too much, that sort of thing. But you don't have any right of appeal. And there's a requirement on the provider to produce this stuff or be fined. So your bank, your building society, whatever, wherever you keep your money, unless it's under a mattress, okay, are now going to be required to give this data to DWP or any other government department, but generally DWP, for the purpose of fraud prevention. They reckon that's going to save billions. I am more dubious about that because I think they're exaggerating the levels of fraud. But what it is going to do is it's going to mean that practically anyone in the UK's bank account, particularly if you have children, okay, is going to be accessible. That's scary, but there you are, it's in there. Moving on to the final data grab, and this one will be very dear to the hearts of people in the NHS. Okay, information standards for health and social care are now extended to systems. So it's always been you had to provide data in particular ways and store it in particular ways, like the SNOMED code, stuff like that. Now it's extended to systems. They can tell you which system to put it in. They can dictate which system to use. If you looked at the budget this year, you would have seen in there, they were set aside quite a big amount of money for sorting out patient records in hospitals, they said, but they also mentioned about having a single patient record. That was hidden in the middle of the budget speech. Just Google it. Just have a look at Hansard and find it, because it's in the middle of it. It is quite well hidden. Basically, this gets all the NHS data into one place, one format, and available to all interests. Gosh, anyone hearing Palantir in the distance? Yeah, exactly. But also those trusted research environments. This is a big, big change. I've included that last sentence, NHS Digital never sell your data, as a sort of I told you so. Okay, right. Back when this bill first came in, I was first talking to people about it, I said the NHS Digital, we will never sell your data bit is going to be basically because some other department's going to sell it. Yes, it is, because they abolish NHS Digital, replace them with NHS Transformation Directorate, and of course they can now sell it because they're not NHS Digital anymore. But that's what this is all about, really. Okay, selling data and grabbing data. Again, a very scary provision. Any questions on the data grabs? No, I'll stand it to silence. Thought you might be. Okay, right. Last page of information, really. This is sort of miscellaneous stuff that was thrown into this bill because it fitted in and other places. Some of it is significant, some isn't. So the births, marriages, death register can now be done electronically. Hoorah! That's a long overdue reform. Should have been done back in the 90s. But basically, you no longer have to go to the register office and sign a wet signature. Okay, thank you, Catherine. Cheers then. Okay, the underground asset register, which is where all the pipelines and stuff are, is also similarly done. Okay, and they've now brought in stuff around digital verification services. I'm not sure where this is going, but this is complete new law which allows verification of anybody electronically. At the moment, it seems to be targeted on immigration checks, but I suspect this is going to be the start of a full UK identification service for all people resident in the UK. That's the way it's going, and as usual, they can change it by regulation anytime they fancy. So there you are. It's on time. Okay, this is a massive change in data protection law. Okay, there's a lot of rights amended or weakened. A lot of independent scrutiny mechanisms removed, which is even more worrying. Data grabs reaching far, far deeper into private information than we've ever seen before. And also there's a protection in here for government and public sector from action by people on data protection. I didn't cover that in any detail, but it is in there. Effectively, they've reduced the rights of people to sue. So there you go. Okay, so first batch of questions. Like I said, I'll switch off the recording after this batch of questions in case you have any more questions you want to ask in a bit more privacy. So there's my contact details. Okay, feel free to contact me about this, and feel free to contact me if you want copies of the slides. Quite happy to share those with everyone. So questions. Okay, yeah, Sean.
Well, I suppose the first question has to be the big one. It's like adequacy. I mean, is this going to remain adequate in terms of like the EU GDPR?
Yeah.
And if not, what would that mean?
Yeah, they in the original impact statement they included that, and they said that it would cost us about $1 billion a year if we lost adequacy, and it would make us about $4 billion a year if we didn't lose adequacy. The new impact statement skirts around that quite a bit. But effectively, I don't think we're going to lose adequacy over the actual legislation, but the regulation may change it. So what I think will probably happen is the EU will say, well, it's sort of okay, but if you put too much regulation on you, we might say no. I think the data grabs are going to be the big one. The replacement of data protection officers with SROs, yes, okay, you've still got someone to go to, and they've still got the duties of data protection officers. So I can't see that being a big problem now. Some of the rights changes, effectively, there's more interference in legitimate interest and things like that. But if you look at French law, for example, French law's got quite a few of these data grabs and stuff in it. I don't think it's that likely to lose its adequacy. It's how big the regulation goes and whether or not there are particular bits they object to strongly. So I think at the moment it's a qualified yes. I think we'll keep it. Okay. All right. So. Any other questions anyone wants to ask? Jamie?
Thanks, Stephen. That was a really useful and interesting presentation, so thank you for that. Probably hundreds of questions, but there's so much in there to unpack that
it's big, isn't it? Yes.
Most all in a short period of time, but I'm interested about the Section 251, the National Data Opt-out, and just how much one organisation, I don't want to say my organisation, any one organisation can shoehorn into the Research Archive and Statistics banner, because I'm guessing this may then well include all secondary uses of planning and what have you for NHS bodies, because it's statistics. You could call it research if you want.
Yeah. Well, you can also call it statistics, you see, because almost all the secondary uses are statistics. Yeah. So does this get rid of the requirement for Section 251 exemption secondary use?
Yeah.
Probably, to be honest. Yeah. I could certainly argue that if you wanted me to. So this is the thing, you see, it does change the landscape massively. It's quite surprisingly big.
And it allows us to pseudonymize without objection.
Without objection, yeah.
Presumably, do we still have to include type 1s?
Well, the question is, the type 1 opt-out was always identifiable data for research purposes. So it's not identifiable data because that person's allowed.
Ah, yes. Okay, yeah.
Okay. The only one I think might still apply is the no GP electronic record sharing, but I expect they'll abolish that one. Okay, so but it's at the moment it would. Yeah.
So at a stroke, and it's under Section 251, of course, you've got your Type 1, your National Data Opt-out, and your local objection process.
Yeah.
And this,
What's the been through? Yeah.
what a lovely, lovely bill.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Great if you want to do secondary use in the NHS. Not so good if you want to keep your data private. There you go.
But all ICBs struggle with these things massively, and there is huge frustration in commissioning land about the desire to create better patient outcomes, which is what we were coming to work for, and the inability to actually use the data to do it.
Yeah,
it's
I don't
huge
think.
frustration.
I don't think this is negative from the point of view of improving the health service. Okay, the national data opt-out and stuff like that was always a bit of a sort of we need to keep things private. Bear in mind, if we're anonymising the data, that it isn't very high risk. Now you can re-identify data fairly easily from 2 or 3 data points. In fact, the Lords on Tuesday used Tony Blair as an example. The reason they use Tony Blair as an example is because Tony Blair, we know his date of birth because he was PM and it's published, and we know he had two heart attacks. We know the dates of them, so therefore we can identify his medical record from those 3 data points. Yeah, that's not unusual. So just this is where there's going to be privacy implications of this, but from the point of view of improving data access for government, yes, it's massive, and for public sector services, yes, it's massive and it's good from that point of view. But from the privacy point of view, it's a really big invasion of privacy. And the question is, okay, the invasion of privacy means that the ambulance that is coming to save you, to quote John Brunner, has got the right blood type in it. Whereas, of course, you can't cheat on your banking anymore because we can also see that data. Which outcome do you want? Yeah.
Well, you can see the arguments, though. I mean, there is actually massive fraud that goes on in this country. You look at the pandemic, and the grants and loans that were given out to businesses. I mean, that's running to billions just on that one example.
Yeah.
So, and actually, that money could go into the NHS if you want to look at it from a government minister perspective, an argument they would use. So I can see the argument. But actually, if we're able to use statistics without Type 1 considerations, national data opt-out considerations, Section 251 considerations, and local objections, actually that could streamline a lot of NHS commissioning.
Yeah, I completely agree. But as I say, it's at the expense of a very, very big data grab in other areas. So we just need to be aware of the ethical issues here. But there you go. That's what we have. That's what we have as a bill. So right. I'm going to stop recording now. So if anyone wants to ask any questions that you want off the record, let me stop recording. Stop.